Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 2, The Sages of China, from the Adepts in the Eastern Esoteric Tradition by Manly Palmer Hall, Part 3, The Sages of China. The Adept, the Sages of China. Like all other highly civilized peoples of antiquity, the Chinese possessed a deep and highly diversified religio-philosophic structure of doctrines and ideas, and divided their intellectuals into several clearly defined groups. Their moral, ethical, and mystical convictions were based upon the great triad of venerated instructors: Lao-tse, Confucius, and Buddha. These three are generally included in the list of world teachers or supreme benefactors of humanity, and have been honored far beyond the boundaries of their own nations and races. They were truly divine men, and their missions and ministries were accompanied by portents and miraculous events. Around each of them have developed elaborate traditional accounts, and each has come to be regarded as the founder of an essential religion or doctrine with which his name was ever after associated. Their conduct became a noteworthy example to all who sought self-improvement. Their words were treasured as scriptural revelations, and the orders, schools, or sects which they founded expanded, gradually taking on the coloring and overtones of theological institutions. In the course of ages, recognition for these teachers increased, and they were elevated by popular regard to a divine or semi-divine estate. Although all arbitrary statements must be to a degree inadequate, it may be said in general that the Chinese philosopher or sage, in the most conservative use of such terms, followed in the footsteps of Confucius. He was a sober man, dedicated to learning and profoundly concerned with the ethical improvement of society. Although he might respect metaphysical speculations, as did Confucius himself, he regarded such abstractions as outside the realms of logic and reasoning. These sages gained distinction as the founders of philosophic schools, were consulted by liberal emperors and statesmen, were entrusted with the instruction of the young, and made numerous contributions to the arts and sciences of their times. Their lives paralleled in many ways the careers of the Greek philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. Often they were suspected of a deeper knowledge than they chose to reveal, but they emphasized such practical attainments as were likely to promote the public good. They moralized on the duties of rulers, encouraged the development of democratic attitudes, advocated philosophic disciplines to refine and ennoble human character, and bestowed, generally speaking, good advice which sincere persons intuitively and instinctively recognized to be true and useful. Chinese sages in discussion, from a ceramic of the Qing dynasty, from Favier's Peking. Both Buddhism and Taoism included scholars of sage-like disposition whose careers paralleled those of the Confucianists. In addition, however, they created orders of mystics or transcendentalists of an entirely different class. Both Buddhism and Taoism involved theological and metaphysical speculations as essential parts of their doctrines. If therefore Confucianism had its great sages, these other groups had their illumined saints, whose attributes and characteristics were similar to the saints of Christendom. In China, the Buddhist saints were called Lohans, Lohan, and the Taoist saints were broadly referred to as the Immortals. The Buddhist Lohans or Arhats were sanctified men who had been either the personal disciples of Buddha or early patriarchs of his doctrine. The group was gradually enlarged, however, to include important leaders and converts of later times, whose dedication to the teachings of Buddha had resulted in illumination and the development of transcendental faculties and powers. Thus, the small circle of 16 or 18 Lohans gradually expanded into the larger circle of 500 saints, and even this term became symbolical of an almost countless assembly of enlightened beings. In Taoism, it is not known whether Lao-tse had a selected group of intimate associates. He was a lonely, isolated man who did not expect others to understand him or the profound doctrine which he taught. In the course of time, however, the abstract intimations about wonderful and miraculous things gained favor and attention, and in the second, or metaphysical period, in the descent of his teachings, the doctrine of the immortals came to be highly emphasized. These mystics claimed to receive instruction from previous saints who had retired from the world and dwelt in celestial regions. They approached favorite disciples in dreams and visions and revealed the secrets of transcendental magic. Under the guidance of some preceding immortal, dedicated students were taught the abstractions of the Chinese Kabbalah, the transmutation of metals, and the secrets of immortality. In this way, a fabulous order of creatures came to be popularly venerated. Legends grew about them, and elaborate symbolical accounts were faithfully preserved as part of Taoist tradition. Dimly beneath the delicate fantasy relating to the Chinese immortals, the outlines of a formal structure of ideas are traceable. As in the case of the Western saint, the philosophical aspect is seldom clarified. Nevertheless, these immortals correspond closely with the orders of Greek heroes like Achilles, Ulysses, and Aeneas. Such historical factors as may have originally existed became subservient to a broad concept or idea which probably originated in India. The human being, by the release of divine resources within his own nature, can transcend the normal limitations of the human state and ascend to a middle distance between gods and mortals. He can become an intercessor. Prayers may be addressed to him, and he stands as a witness to the potential virtue and wisdom locked within the human breast. Taoism borrowed much of its formal organization from the Buddhists and included an elaborate concept of the structure of the universe. There were heavenly worlds where the higher divinities dwelt together, and there were lower worlds inhabited by creatures of all kinds. Only the world of mortals was visible. The other regions could be visited only by the unembodied or the disembodied. Yet there were powers within man by which he could project his own consciousness beyond the limitations of his corporeal form, and during meditation he might be privileged to mingle with the denizens of some transcendent sphere. The immortals were not only a whimsical tribe fashioned from dreams and fantasies, they were the projection of man's concept of his own potential. The human being has always liked to believe that locked within him is the capacity for spiritual and intellectual freedom, for happiness and for growth into a better state. The immortals, therefore, were the projection of man himself. In this way, they were not totally imaginary, for man did not believe that his dreams were merely delusions. The teachings of Taoism and Buddhism assured him that he was actually the citizen of a far larger and nobler universe than he had ever experienced in his daily struggle for existence. He not only believed, but intuitively knew that there were beings superior to himself. He knew they had to exist, and he was perfectly willing to assume that they constituted orders or hierarchies of gods and godlings, like the thrones, dominions, and principalities referred to by St. Paul. The curious combination of high idealism and intense practical thinking which distinguished the Chinese mind led naturally to the formalizing of the concept of the immortals. These creatures were not only possessors of almost limitless magical powers, but were also a convivial group of intensely happy beings who neither hungered nor thirsted, were free from poverty and pain, enjoyed congenial companionship, and were far removed from the tyrannies of corrupt political systems. They had their own government, and because they combined a blissful state with shrewdness of mind, they could, if properly solicited, contribute to the improvement of human conduct, individual and collective. By degrees, these celestials mingled their characteristics with those of the Buddhist Lohan, becoming teachers of those who could communicate with them internally, and benevolent servants of truth-seeking mortals who had renounced worldly wisdom, dedicating themselves to esoteric philosophy. So involved a structure inevitably expanded and ultimately absorbed popular heroes, scholars, and cultural leaders who were given their various places in the transcendental world of Chinese metaphysics. Nearly every highly esteemed person was posthumously elevated to some dignity which entitled him to popular veneration. This drifted naturally in a religious direction and increased the pantheon to huge proportions. Enlightened emperors, victorious generals, outstanding poets, distinguished scholars, and illustrious ancestors shared in the common admiration. There were deities presiding over doorways, moats, walls, cellars, gardens, inns, bridges, and the family hearthstone. Most of these, unlike the Greek nymphs, dryads, and satyrs, were not simply imaginary creatures or elementals, but were traceable to living persons who had once attained some fame or dignity and had been gloriously remembered. Thus, it is possible to divide Chinese illuminates into three general classes. The first was composed of kindly scholars who liked to commune together in some favorite bamboo grove, write poems, discuss politics, and argue problems of logic and reason. There were also wandering monks and priests who, having contemplated deeply the secret books and records of their orders, had gained intuitive powers and dimensions of internal vision and understanding by which they could explore the invisible universe around them. They therefore possessed a knowledge not commonly attainable or generally available. These holy men correspond most closely to the Western concept of godliness and were duly and properly canonized. The third group is a great polyglot, founded partly upon man's instinctive desire to glorify the miraculous, partly upon folklore and legendary, and partly upon the religio-scientific conviction that it was possible for the human being to grow qualitatively until he transcended all the boundaries of the reasonable and became a creature no longer human, yet not truly divine. He was therefore the immortal mortal, living on the boundaries which unite the seen with the unseen. With such a being, anything was possible, yet he was not separate and apart from the great universal plan. He more or less indicated the road that ordinary man must follow, for within each human being is an immortal mortal, forever striving to outgrow the earth and live in the clearer atmosphere of the celestial regions. The immortals did not take the place of the great gods of China, but they lived upon the sides of the heavenly mountain, inwardly strengthened by the fruit of the tree of immortality. Before giving further consideration to the Taoist immortals, it may be well to pause and point out that the typical Chinese scholar-philosopher combined intensely rational procedures with highly intuitive faculties of reflection and insight. He was not only broadly learned, but deeply enlightened. He venerated tradition, but often interpreted it mystically or symbolically. He was an idealistic realist, living under a strict code of ethical and moral procedures. In his private life, he practiced disciplines suggestive of the Hindu holy man, but when he spoke or wrote, he paid strict attention to logic and contributed very little to popular superstition. In the deeper parts of his own nature, however, the sage had the courage to admit the reality of forces and powers superphysical. Like Plato, he affirmed the existence of the gods and their administration of human affairs, but he also assumed that every man was responsible for his own destiny and should occupy himself diligently with the reformation and regeneration of his own character. Thus, in a way, the several types of truth-seekers which flourished together in China, while highly individualistic, held many convictions in common. The Reverend Aubrey Moore supplied an introductory note to the translation of the writings of Chuang-Tzu, prepared by Herbert A. Giles. Of the sages, the Reverend Moore, mentioning the meeting of the Emperor Yao with a hermit, adds, "But greater than Yao and the hermit is the divine being who dwells on the mysterious mountain, a state of pure, passionless inaction. For the sage, then, life means death to all that men think life, the life of seeming or reputation, of doing or action, of being or individual selfhood. The sage knows nothing of the distinction between subjective and objective. The sage sees the many disappearing in the one, in which subjective and objective, positive and negative, here and there, somewhere and nowhere, meet and blend." Chuang-Tzu lived in the 3rd and 4th centuries BC. He has long been classed as a heterodox thinker, and his writings were directed against what he considered the materialism of the Confucian teachings. His various literary works, mostly of an allegorical nature, long found favor among elder intellectuals who had been frustrated or disappointed in public or private life. From Chuang-Tzu, who was strongly influenced by Taoism, can be gathered the attitude of the learned men of his time as this relates to the sages. This was before the metaphysical period in Taoism, when the school was still essentially philosophical and the later embellishments had not gained general favor. A few quotations from the books of Chuang-Tzu indicate a level of thinking comparable with the Greek outlook. According to this erudite scholar, it has been said, "The birth of the sage is the will of God. His death is but a modification of existence. In repose, he shares the passivity of the yin, in action the energy of the yang. He will have nothing to do with happiness, and so has nothing to do with misfortune." Another statement also deserves mention. "The sea does not reject the streams which flow eastward into it. Therefore it is immeasurably great. The true sage folds the universe in his bosom. His good influence benefits all throughout the empire, without respect to persons. Born without rank, he dies without titles. He does not take credit for realities." The subject is again introduced into a dialogue, and Chuang Tzu writes, "The government of the perfect sage," explained Chi-Chi, "consists in influencing the hearts of the people so as to cause them to complete their education, to reform their manners, to subdue the rebel mind, and to exert themselves one and all for the common good. This influence operates in accordance with the natural disposition of the people, who are thus unconscious of its operation." After the decline of Taoist transcendentalism and its gradual integration into a theological sect, the old Chinese concept of the sage as profound counselor, wise philosopher, and venerable person who had enriched his inner life through experience and reflection enjoyed a strong revival. Indicative of this transition is the philosophy of Wang Yangming, AD 1473 to 1529. He was a monistic idealist, affirming that every individual had within himself the capacity to know, but must release and perfect this capacity through the enrichment of his understanding and the constant application of philosophic principle to daily conduct. Of the true sages, Wang writes, "Men of this type never cease in their pursuit of knowledge. The practice of the sage is to be a man who in the joy of its attainment forgets its sorrows. Men of this type are never distressed. Perhaps it is not necessary to say whether he has been successful or not in his pursuit." Later, he expands this definition. The sage may be compared to heaven. There is no place where heaven is not present. The good man may be compared to a lofty mountain peak maintaining his lofty height. Nevertheless, one 1,000 feet high cannot stretch and become 10,000 feet high, and one 10,000 feet high cannot stretch and become 100,000 feet high. The good man does not exhibit and exalt himself. This statement is reminiscent of the story attributed to Mencius of the man who attempted to make his corn grow more rapidly by pulling it each day. Scattered through the writings of Wang are numerous other references to the disposition and attainment of the truly wise. The following quotations are typical. The sage returns to the original condition of his intuitive knowledge, and thus the more refrains from superimposing his own ideas. The contemplation, emptiness of intuitive knowledge is the great emptiness of heaven, and the absence of desire in intuition is the lack of form of heaven. When a sage or virtuous man is placed in a decadent age, his treatment of men and his response to things is at times indirect, but his method of procedure has never been other than direct. The omniscience of the sage has reference to natural law only. His omnipotence has reference to natural law alone. The mind of the sage is clear and intelligent. Therefore, in all things, he knows the place of natural law and carries it out fully in practice. In summarizing the Chinese attitude toward the Confucian sages, the Buddhist Lohans, and the Taoist immortals, it becomes reasonably obvious that these three groups bore witness in various ways to one basic concept or assumption. They all held that two kinds of knowledge exist: the first, traditional, and the second, esoteric or mystical. They further taught that the second kind was superior to the first, that it had always existed in the world, and that it descended through illumined orders or hierarchies of venerable teachers. These teachers in turn derived their inspiration from secret sources. Therefore, beneath the surface of profane learning was a sacred instruction which could be revealed only symbolically or allegorically, and this instruction was a perfect science or method of human regeneration. By these convictions, the Chinese sages become the Eastern equivalents of the Western adepts, or those proficient in the science of sciences. Through the complete knowledge of this, man can transcend earthly limitations and become a conscious instrument for the rehabilitation of society and the restoration of the Golden Age. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.